Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Dauphinais. And today I am pleased to be joined by Father Juan Vélez, a priest of the prelature of Opus Dei and a scholar of John Henry Newman. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be here. Really good.
Yeah, so as listeners may know, Newman's really his teachings and his writings have been such an inspiration to Ave Maria University in particular, and especially his idea of the university, right? His, in a way, defense of education, of the being of a university as consecrated to truth, and right, that truth that ultimately even includes the revealed faith of the Catholic faith, and that this is kind of the natural home of a university is to embrace universal learning, to consider all things, everything in a way within creation, but even that part of creation which was revealed to us, right? Through Jesus Christ and the mission of His Spirit in the Church.
It's so exciting to hear that, because you hardly hear that. Wow, it's fantastic.
It is, and I think it's. Anyway, it's, I know for a long time, every professor at Ave Maria receives a copy of The Idea of the University by John Henry Newman. And as I was developing, this podcast and thinking a little bit more about Newman, I went back to Pope Benedict's 2010 beatification of Newman. It was fascinating. He did it in England, right, which I think was a very rare thing, but he really wanted to do that. And one of the things he highlights, he says there were three particular areas that make Newman relevant to us. So I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about these. But one was that when he became a cardinal, his motto was cor et cor loquitur, heart speaks to heart. And he especially spoke about the way in which this was an attitude of prayer. That human beings could somehow speak to God and God could speak to them. But then what was interesting is moving from that, he then moved immediately to the idea that the pressing issues of our age were, one, faith and reason. Faith and reason, are they compatible? And so it's interesting. So the idea of heart speaking to heart is not just a pious thing, it's actually a reality, because if that can happen, that means then that faith is not against reason. And then in a way, thirdly, he talked about the role of revealed religion in society and within universities. And so I just thought that was a really kind of fascinating theme. So you've been studying Newman for how many years now?
28.
Yeah, like 28 years, right? Decades of your studies. And so, how would you answer that question of why do you think Newman is relevant for our times? Why do we need to kind of make Newman, know Newman better and make him known?
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought that address, the beatification, because Pope Benedict knew Newman's writings and thoughts and was influenced by him, and he really nails it. And I've read it a few times. I'd like to now go over it again.
Oh yeah.
But and I think, well, I'll go back to the question in a moment. But when he, better yet, going directly, Newman addresses the whole person. One thinks initially he's just intellectual, but no, he's addressing the whole person, the person's psychology, their history. He has a historical mind, and so he addresses a person in their background, their whole their situation,
yes,
and their reason, and so it's the whole person, and he speaks to the whole person, and he thinks God speaks to the whole person also. But I think that thinking about our conversation today, that Newman, the reason why he's very, very important for our time is because he puts his finger on atheism or agnosticism. And so he's a man for our times, because in the 19th, 20th century, there's been in the 21st, such a rise in agnosticism and atheism. And Newman really put his finger on it. He's, as you've heard him call another Augustine. Some people think of these three great thinkers in in Christian faith. Or there's many more, but Augustine, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and Newman. Obviously, I'm simplifying, and we could add Benedict XVI in between there, John Paul II. But Newman deals with agnosticism, and you've studied Faith and Reason, and you have a wonderful contribution to that in the volume we'll talk about. But so Newman has his finger on that, and that's why he's relevant for us today. And it's something of both the mind and the heart, the whole person, and how our capacity to know God, and why people get stuck and don't have that knowledge of God for many reasons.
Yeah, that's really, I love the way you express that, because I do think that question, and almost maybe even more agnosticism than atheism, right? Not only knowing that God exists, but knowing that we can know something about him, and that we can know something meaningful and true about him, and that gives then meaning and truth to our lives.
Certainly.
So could you say more about?
Certainly, because the agnosticism that he deals with is it leads to what was doctrinal agnosticism, but it leads to moral agnosticism, moral relativism.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking that moral relativism today, I was thinking that's another, what we could call it, moral agnosticism. So both the doctrinal and the moral is unclear, and we think we cannot know. And Newman, as we know, talked about natural religion and what we can know through reason. So on the one hand, he expressed what we can know about God, but then he talks about revealed religion. So he addresses that knowledge of God through the natural, through a use of reason, and then through a use of reason illumined by grace, which is faith, and the revealed religion. He had to deal with in the 19th century head on, because beginning with his brother Charles, who had doubts of faith at a young age, and so Newman starts addressing and thinking about this, and then his brother Francis also, who was a Christian but had a lot of strange ideas. So at a young age, Newman begins to deal with this, but then his surroundings are surroundings of a country that's going through the Industrial Revolution. Well, it's about to begin the Industrial Revolution, and then Scientific Revolution, and everything's up for grabs. Everything's the truths about God are put in question.
Yeah, and for just by way of context, so Newman's born in like 1801 or so. He ends up becoming, I think he's like the youngest graduate of Oriel College at Oxford, and becomes basically a professor there in his young 20s.
Right.
And really lives this great, as an Anglican at this time, helps to kind of spearhead this wonderful renewal movement within Anglicanism within Oxford called the Oxford Movement, really back to the Fathers, to try to renew the liturgical, moral, and doctrinal life of Anglicanism by bringing the Fathers as the kind of definitive moment of the reception of biblical revelation. But as he does that, of course, he as he's thinking through that, eventually he begins to, question whether or not Anglicanism or the Church of England is the Church of the Fathers. And I think it's in 1843, absolutely, yes. So when he's about 42 or so, that he begins to almost have a little bit of a crisis of faith. He begins to see that, no, the Church of England is not the Church of the Fathers. And he says at one time he's on his deathbed with respect to Anglicanism. But it was interesting. It was 2 years. It took 2 more years. It wasn't until 1845 that he entered the Catholic faith, studied, became a Catholic priest, came back to England, was actually asked by, I think it was Pius IX, to found the Catholic University of Ireland. And it was really as he was giving the lectures for the Catholic University of Ireland in Dublin that we have the idea of the university. And then he eventually, carries out his work as an Oratorian priest, leads a community. At some point writes this great Apologia Pro Vita Sua, really a defense of his life in some ways, defense of his religious convictions. And then really only at the end of his life, by Leo XIII, is declared a cardinal. Maybe it was like in 1883 or around that time?
1879.
1879. Thank you. It's always good to have a scholar with me. And he, in that address, though, that he gives on becoming a cardinal, or being created a cardinal, as the language goes,
Right.
he says that his entire life has been trying to work against, right, liberalism in religion, in religious thinking, this idea that there's no real truth available in doctrine.
Yeah.
So could you say a little bit about that idea that, like,
Sure.
that he would say that as he summarizes his whole life that's been given as a priest, first as an Anglican, then as a Catholic, in and outside of universities, founding universities, trying to renew the Anglican Church, then coming into the Catholic faith, and all these different things.
Yeah.
Could you say about what does he mean by that, and why is that important for our age?
Well, just a small thing before.
Yeah.
I'm glad you introduced his history and summarized his history. He was very young when he went to Oxford at 16,
Yes.
but then
Mm-hmm.
then he actually entered when he was 17. But he was admitted when he was 16,
Yes.
and he graduated from Trinity College. But then
Okay.
taught at Oriel.
Oh, yes.
Taught at Oriel.
Yes.
And that's where
Yeah.
he grew and developed and taught.
Mm-hmm.
Going now to the end of his life,
Yeah.
I find, he died in 1889, so
Mm-hmm.
1890, excuse me. So he lived as a cardinal for 11 years. But in 1879, that speech really sums up, I think, in as much as you can sum up a lot of his life, or the thrust of his life.
Yeah.
And reading it today again, I thought, gee, I need to write a long article about this.
Yes.
Or more, because it has so much. So he's looking back at his life, and he says, for 30, 40, 50 years or more, this has been my life struggle. And to teach that religion is objective, that there's an objective data of revealed religion.
Mm-hmm.
And as he says, well, liberalism in religion is to think that there is no, that my religion is as good as yours, that my truth is as good as your truth, that I can choose the beliefs that I want. And he says, well, that's contrary to reason, that you can't have two truths that are opposite, that are different. It's contrary to reason, and it's contrary to revealed religion, to the revealed fact.
Mm-hmm.
And he does that in his life, in his preaching, in his sermons. He does that in the Oxford University sermons that we can refer to in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
The Apologia is an explanation of how he came about to distinguishing which he thought was the true fold of Christ, what Christ had established, the Catholic
Mm-hmm.
Church,
Yeah.
distinguishing it from Protestant churches, so that he thinks that there's objective ways of thinking about religion, about faith, and you can make decisions about that. You should make decisions. But basically, he's addressing this fact that's very ingrained in society, that we really can't be sure about the truth, and that my religion is as good as your religion,
Mm-hmm.
and that all religions basically are the same.
Yeah.
And we hear this all the time, that most religions are basically the same. And that's appealing because, in a way, I mean, there's a grain of truth that we're talking about. There's one God, and there's a few, and that religion should bring people together. It's not meant to. And so there's there's some common truths in religion about God as creator. Well, not all religions. God as creator, God
Mm-hmm.
as the one who judges, the one who rewards, God who is good. So we say, well, these things are true. So then my religion is as good as yours. Religion is all the same,
Mm-hmm.
but obviously it's not. And so he, throughout his life, works, teaches this, and teaches the distinction of the objectivity of religion. Now, there's a subjective nature because we have to make religion our own, or we have a personal relationship with God. But there are truths that are objective, and that if we call them into question, we have to give good, solid reasons for that, which are lacking,
Mm-hmm.
which are wanting. So he made that his life's work, and that's why reading Newman, studying Newman is very important for our times. It really is. I'm convinced with that. So yeah, that's his life work. In fact, is I think showing the harmony between faith and reason. Faith properly understood respects reason. As you've written, faith is an act of reason, but it goes beyond reason. And illumined by grace, we're able to go further than our reason can go. But it's not contradictory to reason.
Yeah. I think one thing that he says there is that idea that just like reason can move from certain things I can understand on my own to other things, and I can move from propositions to conclusions and these sorts of different things. Reason can also learn from hearing from other people, and sometimes I'm going to just have to take on trust what other people say. Right? He gives the example of the fact that London is an island, or not London, England being larger, being an island, and these different things. I'm not going to go around and test it. It would be a waste of my life. I have to trust this element. He says sometimes, like if we want to be absolutely certain of everything, we have to crawl on the ground. But if we want to soar, we have to kind of trust what others have told us and then sift them. But we begin with trusting, and then we sift whether or not those seem true. This is how we live in the natural world. Right. This is how science progresses. If science had to begin again at the beginning every time for each individual scientist, there would be no science.
Right.
Science can only develop because it largely trusts what other people.
There's a beautiful parallel there with our human life. The human reason, we trust, and supernatural we have to trust also.
And so therefore it's not against reason to trust the words of the apostles. Yeah. The words of the apostles when they say not just that, you can do this scientific experiment, so, try a new one, but they actually say this man, Jesus, rose from the dead and sent us his Holy Spirit. And if you believe, and so it's the same, it's an elevated mode, but a lot of our wisdom comes from, trusting in the word of others. And we simply, as he puts it in a lot of ways, we don't have the luxury of having absolute certainty. We have to kind of, we're thrown into a world and we have to throw ourselves, in a way, forward. We have to kind of make a judgment, and we can find certitude, as he puts it, even if in a certain sense we don't have absolute certainty.
Right. You in a paper, a chapter on this book, and John Henry Newman, a guide to John Henry Newman, his life and thought. You talk about how you explain how Newman talks of the need for the predisposition of to trust. You have to have a certain humility. You have the predisposition to that you don't know everything, that you have to learn from others. And also that it requires love. If you don't love something or someone, then you're not going to get to know them or interact with them because you're putting up a wall. So these predispositions of humility and love are necessary. You could elaborate on that but I wanted to, before we forget, Newman saw the church fathers, those authors of the first centuries of the church who were known for holiness and their wisdom and writings, that he saw them as the best interpreters of the teachings of the apostles and their successors. And so Newman said at one point in his life, he said, "The fathers made me Catholic." If you remember. And so reading about the fathers, especially the early church fathers, St. Irenaeus, St. Justin, Basil, St. Gregory Nazianzen, St. Augustine, the fathers made me Catholic. He was trusting on their understanding of the scriptures, and together with the magisterium, or the early magisterium. So he trusted in their understanding, and you build on that. But you don't invent religion in the 20th century or 19th century. You're standing on the shoulders of giants, and these were the giants. But so it requires trust. Anyhow, that harmony and faith, I think, is one of the great things that Newman has to teach us, and that when there's true science does not encroach on religion or contradict religion. And true faith allows science to study and to try to establish natural truths without quelching scientific study or discovery. This is one of the great one of the great false claims against Christianity is that the faith is opposed to science, which is absurd.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because when he starts the Catholic University of Ireland, and you have an essay about this, but one of the first things he starts is a school of medicine. Right. And of course, he's also arguing for the need for philosophy and theology, but he starts a school of medicine, applied science, because this is what kind of, science in a certain sense, as we understand it in the Middle Ages and afterwards, was really born just as the universities were from the heart of the church.
Right.
And that's conviction, by the way, right, in the unity of truth, because it all is part of one world from one creator, and that revelation is also part of that same world because God entered into our world, right, spoke his word, communicated that word historically. And that's why not that same principle in a way then not only is his understanding of the university, faith and reason, science and faith, but also even his understanding of when he talks about doctrine, his essay on the development of doctrine, which he wrote basically, right in his, at the end of his time as an Anglican, as he's becoming Catholic, when he says, somewhat famously, but to go deep into history, right, is to cease to be a Protestant. And right, this is not to dismiss, by the way, like he writes this as somebody who was a very deeply and devoutly committed Protestant for 30 years, right? So he's not being dismissive, but he did see that to go deep into history is to see, right, that revelation isn't abstract. Revelation is historical and embodied, and therefore, just as the rest of our lives are historical and embodied, it becomes subject to kind of almost, we can investigate it and we can look into it. As you pointed, you can kind of say, okay, yeah, wow, those are the apostles, those are the fathers. That's the church that is continuing in that tradition.
Right. Yeah, one of his first writings was the history of the Arians. It's not he wrote before that on miracles, but it's look at the early church history, the third and fourth century, their councils, with the difficulties, but also with achievements, and the work of trying to articulate our beliefs in God based on divine revelation and applying the mind to that. But he's very historically minded. He understands that he's not naive about the difficulties of interpreting the scriptures and establishing doctrines, and also that the church also develops over time, and the doctrine develops over time, but one has to have safeguards to make sure that that is a true development of the.
I think that's partly why some people see him kind of like as a modern church father, that he is aware of how much in modernity we tend to feel historically dislocated. Once we become aware of how shaped we are by history, many people feel kind of lost in history, that if everything we say is historically, culturally, linguistically conditioned, then how can we speak any truth? And if the church is historical, then how can it have any truth? And so the beautiful thing about Newman is Newman lived in that world, the same world we live in, with the same sorts of questions. And he was able to articulate that, yes, this is difficult, and yes, it is possible. And we've always been historical beings. So like either, we have to kind of, we'd have to kind of shut down our whole experience of being human, which is not only that we are historical, but also that we discover truth. Not only that we're historical, but also that we're moral beings, right? And this is where he, I think, really is able to defend this aspect that in and through the historical world of God's creation and philosophically knowable and experienced, and then the revelation of God who comes into the world, again, historically, and we can talk about it because it happened in time, right? That through those aspects, we can still attain truth. Not the absolute certainty maybe that Descartes wanted, as though we could doubt everything, but in a genuine way. Again, that we could, certainty may be a standard that's not fully human. You almost have to kind of it's almost like an angelic certainty. but he says we can come to certitude. We can come to resting in certain judgments that we've made on which I am sure, and I will cast my life. Right? And if you think about this, I think sometimes our understandings of love, right, our understandings of family, right? Like I'm certain enough of those realities that I would give my, that I might give my life for a loved one.
We rest in them. We're not judging them all the time.
That's exactly right. We rest in them. And I think that's what he does, is he kind of shows this, but he does it in a beautiful way that really defends this. And so,
let me add something.
Yeah.
There's always been historians, the Greek historians and
yes.
others, but the 19th century, at least in England and Germany, in France and before, flourishing of history.
Yes.
And history becomes like the paradigm, so to speak.
Yeah.
Later on, 20th century, it's psychology, and then the empirical science are like the paradigm of truth. Well, so Newman is really kind of there. He's aware of that. He knows history, but he's unfazed in a sense, because the truth, historical truth, is not contrary to revelation. Precisely, God reveals himself in the prophets and then his son, as you've mentioned a few times. So he's not phased. And then towards the end of his life, he writes on inspiration and two short essays, and before that, in the 1840s, he writes on the apparent. It's tract 73, the apparent contradictions in Scripture. Many questions that arise, and he says, well, yes, but we believe because we don't understand everything, but we believe. And he gives reasons for that, but he's aware that there are difficulties in the Scriptures.
Yes.
This book might have been written by a few persons, or something might have been added, interpolated, but that does not invalidate Scripture. That does not, put aside the real data. So it's wonderful. He's not. He's very much attuned to history, and he says we have to be patient in looking for answers and have faith. But you were going to say maybe you were going to change to another topic. I don't know.
Well, yeah, let's take a break, and then when we come back, I really want to talk about the book that you've edited, this guide to John Henry Newman, his life and thought. So we'll dive into that after the break.
Great.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University. If you'd like to support our mission, we invite you to prayerfully consider joining our Annunciation Circle, a monthly giving program aimed at supporting our staff, faculty, and Catholic faith formation. You can visit us at avemaria.edu to learn more. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
Welcome back to the Catholic Theology Show. Today I am joined by Father Juan Vélez, priest of the prelature of Opus Dei. And we are talking about St. John Henry Newman. And Father Vélez has edited a book published by Catholic University of America Press called A Guide to John Henry Newman, His Life and His Thought. I was honored and pleased to be able to be kind of part of a soft editorial team that helped work with Father to pull this together in different ways. I think we ended up with 27 essays by scholars trying to show the importance of really just John Henry Newman as a tremendous resource and someone really worth studying and worth learning from. So again, it's exciting to have you on the show, Father.
Michael, I'm so happy to be talking about Newman, as you can imagine. And I want to say to those who are listening, Michael suggested the title of the book. I had a similar title, but Michael came up with the title, and I'm very grateful to your help, as there were a few people like you, 2 or 3, who were helping me with the editorial ideas, and even though I edited the book, but and I really like your chapter on faith and reason. And when I talk about the book, they ask, well, what chapter should I begin with? And I invariably refer to your chapter as one of my favorites. But because it's such an important topic, as we were talking about before, there's many other good chapters. And I don't know, maybe you would like to ask me about it, or
and thank you very much. That's very kind. And And it's fun. It's interesting because in some ways, right? I didn't study Newman because I thought Newman would be interesting to study. I read Newman early on because I myself had come to faith after having having an experience of kind of atheism and agnosticism and antagonism, right? You might put it, to the church and to God and to Christianity, and I felt and experienced a strong tension between modern, quote unquote, scientific ways of thinking about things and the faith. And so it really, that work is just really the fruit of my own, I don't know, reading Newman for almost 30 years now, off and on. And so I'm great that if it's been able to be of help to anyone, that's really wonderful to see. So to begin with, though, I thought kind of like, especially for some of our, I think hopefully some of our listeners and viewers want to learn more about Newman, but also just how fun to get to speak with an editor of a volume. So what made you decide that you were going to pull together, right, 27 authors and try to do a whole new book on Newman? So say a little about that.
There's very good authors. I don't want to mention names because I would leave people out, but there's people who've written about Newman, teach Newman. A number of them, like 6 or 7, are converts. There's two women authors. I wish we would have had more, but there's a few priests. It's a really exciting group of people who've studied Newman, and basically at the canonization of Newman, which is on October 13th, 2019.
Yes.
I got to be there in Rome. It was a joy to be to be there. It was a beautiful sunny day. 5 people were canonized in St. Peter's Square. Pope Francis canonized St. Henry Newman. Well, around that time and shortly after, I looking at another volume published by a university, a volume on Newman, I began to see that there was need for a volume that presented Newman, a more fuller account of Newman. I'll explain that in a moment. A fuller account, and then secondly, that was also more favorable or less putting into question things of Newman. Not to say, and I'll address that too. So the first part about a fuller account of Newman. Well, for example, for Newman, friendship was huge, as you know from his letters.
Yes,
like 33 volumes of letters, and his biographies. And we have 2 chapters here on friendship, and so friendship, and it's part of that core loquitur, and his way of being that is part of a fuller picture of Newman. In other words, we present Newman as this intellectual many times, and we forget that he was a priest. He was concerned for people. He was the head of a house of other priests. He cared for the people in his community. So a fuller account of Newman in that sense. There's a chapter on poetry. There's a chapter on Newman as a student of the classics, which is part of that account of Newman. There's now I would have liked more, like a chapter on his prose, and somehow there's one of the chapters a little bit on his prose, but we didn't get to that. But even though other volumes have accounts of many of these things, we were trying. A chapter on poetry, a good chapter on poetry by Barbara Wyman. We wanted to present an account of Newman that included more of the person. In fact, the book's divided into part 1 and part 2. The first part is on Newman as a person, as a convert, as an oratorian, as a preacher, sermons, as a philosopher. In the second, and then the second part, which actually deals with my second consideration, was that in many volumes, more recent volumes, or at least some recent volumes, Newman is questioned. He's put into the accuser's bench, and so especially the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, as if Newman is singing his praises and kind of exaggerating and inventing things, and And clearly from reading of Newman, I just, that doesn't make sense to me. And his life and his writings, I say, where is all this questioning of Newman? Now, this doesn't mean that we can't disagree with him and that he says he's the end and the be all of things. There's other things that are developed after Newman, but we have to approach the author, especially an author like him, with respect and not as like putting him question mark about his sexuality, his thoughts about evangelicals, that his being really an authentic Anglican. People would question that he think that he was a closet Catholic and was really undermining Anglicanism, things like that, which are not true and are just. So I said, well, we need to try to look at these things and to present Newman in a more fuller way and also in a more calm and positive manner.
Yeah. And I think one other thing too that really struck me when you had approached me with the idea of developing the volume is, it is, in some ways in our day within the scholarly world, sometimes history also becomes the predominant discipline. So it's as if the historians would give the definitive account of Newman, and there's obviously it's a beautiful thing to be a historian, right? How wonderful.
And we've been talking about that.
Exactly. How wonderful to have history. So totally, it's a beautiful discipline, and there are many beautiful historians. And there's also philosophy and theology, and this idea that it's important to understand Newman in his context, but it's more important to try to come to see the realities that Newman tried to see philosophically and theologically. And there is a way that sometimes, that's it's like it's like Aquinas could read Augustine even if he didn't know everything historically about Augustine, because there's a question of truth. And it doesn't mean that the truth isn't embodied in historical context and that historical learning isn't an important part of the overall learning. But we can also say, well, you know what? We're looking into certain things from a historical mode. And now we can also then, we can at the same time, we don't need to, I guess what I'm saying is we don't need to establish everything historically first and then begin to raise questions about truth in a theological or philosophical manner. Insofar as we have writings, they raise for us questions of truth. And it's appropriate for us as, truth-seeking beings, as Homo sapiens, right? As, so to speak, kind of, that we are also kind of the cor et cor loquitur. Newman speaks to our heart.
Right.
And he raises certain questions for us as kind of as a preacher, as a rhetorician, as just such a gifted orator, really is such a beautiful command of English prose in a very Victorian mode. So it's sometimes a little challenging for people to read. But then when he speaks to us, the first claim that in a way it makes on us is this true? What does it help me to see? Does it help me to see parts of my reality that I couldn't see before? And again, that I think it's just very important within the fuller context to also make sure that we remain beings that are capable of coming to know the truth about God, about ourselves, about the world, both in a philosophical mode and in a theological mode.
I couldn't have said it as you said it. You said it so well, but that was in my mind without being able to articulate well. I was saying, no, there's something here that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
And recently I've read a few good articles with historical research about Newman, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Sheds light on Newman.
Absolutely.
Newman and the theologians in the 19th century, Newman's library in Oriel, what he consulted at Oriel College. Very, very good things. But I had that concern of what you're saying right now, that somehow that history can't be the arbiter of understanding truth or the person or the truth claims of religion.
Yeah.
And now, anyhow, it's a complex situation of what. But I tried to bring that about to express that. Although I really like the way you did it, I tried to do that in the introduction. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's so maybe just for kind of listeners who obviously haven't read the book yet, or who aren't familiar with you, would you say a little bit about how did you, right, come to study theology? How did you come to study Newman? How did Newman become kind of like the anchor of your intellectual and scholarly life?
Well, I studied, my family's from Colombia. I studied medicine in Colombia, and then did residency training in Pittsburgh in internal medicine. I joined Opus Dei along in the way, this prelature or this organization in the Catholic Church, founded by Saint Jose Maria Escrivá. And I was asked at one point if I wanted to study theology, and I considered the priesthood. So I went to Rome to study theology, but I still didn't know Newman. And then when I went to Navarra, the University of Navarra, for a second time, I had studied medicine there. I had finished my medicine there, but I went the second time. I did doctoral work, and the way I chose it is I read a book by Father Jose Morales, who died last year. He was a real great Newman scholar, did a lot, especially in to making Newman known in the Spanish-speaking world. And Father Jose had a biography, or has, although he died last year, on Newman. I read his biography, and I must have read it rather fast, and I was taken by it, just really taken by the figure of Newman, as I had been taken by the figure of Jose Maria Escrivá some years before, reading a biography of his. And his passion for truth, Newman was very sincere, very studious, very committed to the truth as he learned the truth about the faith, and so I was very impressed by Newman, and I wanted to know more about Newman. So I started reading, and that became a master's thesis, and then a doctoral dissertation. So it was basically it was almost experiential, if you could say, because I hadn't I knew little about theology, and I hadn't thought about a lot of things. But it was the person of Newman and his humanity. I thought he was a wonderful person. I really, I could sense that. And
I think that is a fascinating thing about Newman, that it is in a certain sense his own personal witness to the truth, to engaging the truth, and it's not. I was even thinking about that. You were talking about some people who kind of question the exact veracity of the Apologia Pro Vita Sua. Well, in some ways, right, he wrote that because he was attacked by Charles Kingsley, is basically saying, well, all Catholics lie, or all Catholics will lie because they will do what the Pope says. They're not genuinely exercising their own conscience. It's a major thing. He ended up writing I think he wrote the entire, less. It was something like, I think it was almost like
6
4
weeks.
Yeah, exactly, like 4 to 6 weeks of just writing, like no computer, just from morning till evening.
10,
and he just
10, 12, 14 hours a day.
Exactly. And so I'm sure in some ways that somebody could go back and say, well, technically he actually says this here, and if you go back and look, he actually messed up the years when he was at Oxford or something.
Right.
But the idea that was a kind of vigorous defense of, really, can religious people be trusted? Can you use your conscience to believe in revelation, to believe in what God has spoken, to believe in a living church, that not only did God speak in history, but that God continues to speak through the vicar of Christ, right? So, and it's like a lot of his writings, again, are, when he writes the essay on development, it's because he's wrestling with trying to understand, are the teachings of the church today the same as the teachings of the apostles? And the ultimate answer is yes, right? And a lot of his other works, again, they're kind of somewhat, they're controversies. They're responding to different questions. They're engaging different things.
So it makes it very personal.
Yes.
And he's answering questions, well, for himself.
Yes.
But that help other people. I've met many people on the line in my life that have said Newman really influenced me, really helped me. And it's because he's addressing questions that people that he was wrestling with, and that people have. So I think this book is helpful, and it's a type of book that you don't read from cover to cover, but you read a chapter here, you read 2 or 3 chapters, put away, and then later on, if you want to consult, you read another chapter. I think Newman is a great saint for our times and for the evangelization.
Mhm.
There's so many Newman centers in the country. I wish we could give a copy to each chaplain a Newman center. I've given out many dozens, but that we could give to Newman chaplains, professors, because I think Newman really has a lot to say to the questions that we have and in our minds, and so I think that I think we have to read more. People have to read, and they have to think about the idea of the university, think of development of doctrine, faith and reason, revelation.
For somebody who might be interested in learning more about Newman or reading more, what are some suggestions you might, give them?
Good. I'm glad because I was thinking about that, but glad you reminded me. Well, one thing is with reading Newman's writings, I think it's important first it's helpful to read a biography of Newman because now you're going to ask me which biography. I don't know. Because what happens is that he makes you really. Sometimes it's hard. The reasoning is engaging, but it's demanding. So it's helpful to read a biography of Newman. Well, Louis Bouillet has a very good biography. Louis Bouillet,
and that's a Bouyer,
right?
For those who are interested,
a theologian.
Has the one by Jose Morales that you spoke about been translated?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay.
It's very good. But
I'm surprised. So. Is that one of your desiderata?
Well, I wrote a biography of Newman.
That's right, yes.
Called Passion for Truth, The Life of John Henry Newman.
Wonderful.
I wasn't going to bring that up right now, but I did.
No, that's beautiful. Yeah, that's a service. That's a great service. And was that published?
By St. Benedict.
Okay.
Yeah. But in a second, other biography will come to mind. So I think a biography is helpful. But the sermons, Newman's sermons in the parochial and plain sermons are very helpful. I jotted down some of the ones one that I like very much is Ventures of Faith.
Yeah. By the way, the new president of Ave Maria University, Mark Middendorf, loves Newman's sermon on Ventures of Faith.
Is that right?
And always mentions it and said that he basically read it almost when he was deciding to come here. And then when he was inviting people to come with him, sent them
Is that right?
the Ventures of Faith. So that really is and I do think that the parochial and plain sermons, there's a beautiful Ignatius Press version that has all 8 volumes in one little, I think it's about probably like 800 thin pages. But they're masterful, and they're also available online. I believe it's like a screen. That's what is it like?
Newmanreader.org.
Newmanreader.org. But those are some. And what were a couple of those other sermons?
The Indwelling Spirit. He has some about the Holy Spirit. The Tears of Christ. I mean, just the word, and we could read it for Lent. Tears of Christ. Another one called Faith and Love. Although that's a recurring theme. But faith and love, and then watching. His idea of watching and watching for Christ, looking out for Christ in Advent. But there's many wonderful sermons, and then I thought the novels. He has 2 short novels. One's called Callista, about a 4th century Christian or a pagan who becomes Christian in northern Africa. Callista, it's a moving story, it's a drama, and it really tells us a lot about friendship and evangelization. It's fabulous.
Yeah.
And then Faith, Loss and Gain, which is his first Catholic writing, and it's it's really like autobiographical, as you know. So those are some things, but then he has these great books. The idea of university is just wonderful. So many things. I think the Apologia is a tough one, but it's very, very beautiful. And I'm sorry that this volume doesn't have a chapter on the Apologia. The editor of the Catholic University gave me a limit of words, but there should have been a chapter on the Apologia. I should have pushed for that.
Everything's incomplete, right? It's a lifelong learning. And
what is one of your favorite sermons, or what would you suggest?
There are 2 that come to mind. One is one that he writes called "The Religion of the Day," and
I had it written.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So, and I think he basically what he says is the religion of the day is kind of contemporary popular religiosity.
Feelings.
Yeah, it might be that basically Christianity makes you feel better. Maybe you should be kind of optimistic. Maybe things will work out. Our society's probably a good thing and it ought to continue, just like it's this sort of thing. And we tend to basically, it's like and we think it's kind of like Christianity, but it's largely just this kind of worship of, and it has Christian fragments, absolutely, genuine maybe sense of regard for the other,
good taste,
sense
of propriety,
and yet ultimately, we're still, the focus is basically on us and our common life and improving it,
right?
And he then contrasts that with Christianity, which kind of comes into the world, built upon in a way the suffering of Israel, and the fidelity ultimately of Israel, largely the fidelity of God and the infidelity of the people of the Old Testament, but then ultimately comes, is born to the cross. There's an aspect of somewhat kind of like, there's an aspect of darkness that is unmasked in Christianity, where we see that we're not all well, society is not all well, and he even has that line where he says kind of like, religion ought to be gloomier, which is
stark and gloomy, but it's a recognition of fallen man and the need for grace.
And then it allows us to speak the truth, because I feel like the problem is when you have kind of like a naive Christianity that's floating around, then you have the problems of like injustice, and then people get attracted to say Marxism, because they're at least dealing with the real problems of the world, versus this kind of vapid, somewhat naive Christianity. It says, no, like you got to go, if you go back to really what Christianity is, this is beautiful. So, and then there's another one that I think the title just escaped me, but I share it with our master's students where, anyway, just one line, he says basically, but I want the same people to be kind of like oracles of philosophy and like shrines of devotion. It's a beautiful one about the need to kind of really, faith and reason aren't something that is united outside of us, but they really have to be united in us.
Is that the title of Angels? Does it say something? No.
I don't think so. So there'll be a mystery. People can try to find it. But if you Google oracles of philosophy, you can probably, shrines of devotion, you can find.
It might be one of the sermons that he gave at the University of Ireland, because he gave a number. He gave a number of them, and it might be. But that's beautiful. So I think the other one summarizes his thoughts so much of the religion of the day. He really really describes that,
and it really shows the deep hope that basically Christ enters into the midst of our pain and suffering and woundedness. And Newman's right, conversion wasn't all easy. He talked a lot about how he was deeply broken in part by the loss of his friends, the loss of his colleagues, the loss of, in a certain sense, his family members. He has a quote later on in his life where he says, for me, it was like, for years, the only consolation, my only earthly consolation has been in the Eucharist. I mean, this is just a beautiful thing. So just as we're wrapping up, Father, can I ask you just 3 questions? One, what's a book you've been reading?
A book I've been reading? What have I been reading? Well, I read the Apologia just recently.
That's a good answer.
But I've been reading The Passion of Christ in Spanish. It's a book called La Pasión del Señor by a Spanish author and Luis de la Palma. So getting ready for Lent, Passion of Christ, and
that's fine. That's great.
That's what comes to mind right now.
That's great. And what's a out of obviously many as a priest, etc., but just what's maybe one kind of daily practice that you use that you find helpful to really discover this presence of God?
Yeah. Well, I as many Christians do, hopefully more and more will do it, is read the gospel every day, 5 minutes. And before I used to read it like straight through, but now I kind of I read and I reread and the Gospels or the New Testament. Yeah. And, so I think we really have to help people to read the Word of God, to reflect on it, to let it sink in. So it's been a kind of rediscovery for me the last few months of reading it slower, the last year, reading it slower since the last retreat, just wanting to more intentionally reading the Scripture.
That's beautiful. And last question, what's maybe a view or like a belief you held about God that you later, that you discovered was false, and then what was the truth you discovered?
So not exactly answering the question, but But the last few years, I've been with the inspiration of Saint Jose Maria Escrivá and John Paul II, Saint John Paul, kind of discovering the person of the Holy Spirit. So I've always believed in the Holy Spirit, obviously.
Yes.
But kind of just being more attentive to the Holy Spirit. Sometimes I wish it was all the time.
Yes.
And discovering he's a person. Saint John Paul says he's the gift person. So the gift of the Father and the Son, but that gift is a person. It's very beautiful, and I'm not ready to talk more about it right now. But it's and I'm only just beginning. But it's a good discovery.
That's beautiful. Well, Father Juan Vélez, thank you so much for being on our show. And just for people who are interested, so the book published by Catholic University of America Press is called A Guide to John Henry Newman, His Life and Thought. It has 27 essays and along with an introduction. So I think it's a wonderful resource, and it is somewhat scholarly in nature. So, if you are, it said if you're not interested maybe in getting it for yourself, you might consider maybe for a seminarian or a priest friend or a student of theology. And any of the listeners of the show, if you go to the CUA website, can type in CT, Catholic Theology, not show, but just CT, 20, and you'll get 20% off.
That's right.
So,
my goodness, I don't know if it's CT10 or CT20. I think it's CT20. I think it's CT20.
Well, try both. We'll see what happens. Anyway, thank you again so much, Father, for being on the show.
This has been wonderful, especially because your participation in the book and your love for Newman.
Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. If you like this episode, please rate and review it on your favorite podcast app to help others find the show. And if you want to take the next step, please consider joining our Annunciation Circle so we can continue to bring you more free content. We'll see you next time on the Catholic Theology Show.